Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Fletcher with a trumpet for my people. Today is August 23rd, 2026. I want to bring a very important study today entitled, Was Jesus Born on September 11th, 3 BC? The Revelation 12 Sign. Over the last several months, I've been studying a number of biblical patterns and signs in the heavens that have caused me to pay very close attention to September 11th, 2026, the evening when the Feast of Trumpets begins this year. And while studying the significance of this date, I came across another fascinating possibility. Jesus Christ may have been born on September 11th, 3 BC. Researchers such as Ernest Martin, whose work was later studied and discussed by Michael Heiser, have presented a case based on biblical chronology, history, and astronomy, especially the heavenly sign described in Revelation chapter 12. The woman associated with Virgo, clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet, giving birth to the male child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Before we get into all that evidence, I want to begin by simply showing you the sky. To find September 11th, 3 BC in this astronomy program, you have to enter -2, 09, 11. That may look confusing because we are looking for 3 BC, not 2 BC. The reason is that our normal historical calendar has no year zero. It goes from 1 BC directly to AD 1. Astronomers, however, use a year zero for their calculations. So year zero is 1 BC, year -1 is 2 BC, and year -2 is 3 BC. So when this program shows -2 September 11, we are looking at the historical date September 11, 3 BC. And here we can actually see the proposed Revelation 12 configuration. Virgo, the sun within the constellation, and the moon near her feet. We will also look at the larger connection involving Leo, Regulus, and Jupiter, and why these have been associated with the birth of the Messianic King. Now I want to move forward more than 2,000 years to September 11, 2026. This is the evening when the Hebrew calendar turns to 1 Tishri and the Feast of Trumpets begins. And again, we are watching Virgo, Leo, the sun, the moon, and Jupiter in the same region of the heavens. I'm not saying that the 2026 sky is an exact repetition of the September 11, 3 BC sign. It is not. But considering all of the signs we have been following leading toward the Feast of Trumpets this year, I believe the September 11 connection deserves our careful consideration. So in this study, we are going to ask, was Jesus born September 11, 3 BC? And if so, what significance might there be in watching September 11 and the Feast of Trumpets again in 2026? Let's begin with the Revelation chapter 12 sign.
You'll notice I've put the stick figures in now for the constellation so you can see this a little better. We've got in the center there, that's Virgo. She doesn't look as attractive as a stick figure. Sun, moon at her feet. Jupiter and Regulus co-joined. And what is the constellation above Virgo? It's the lion. It's Leo. What does that mean to a Jew? The lion is the sign of what? This is a zodiac mosaic in a Jewish synagogue. There are a lot of these, a couple dozen of them, that archaeologists have found. And you would look at this and say, well, these Jews must have been pagans then. No, they had a different perception of what was going on in the sky and who's in charge and what it means, as opposed to the pagans. Pagan astrology, astronomy, there really wasn't much of a difference in the ancient world, is more like what we think of today with horoscopes, that individual birth signs, when I was born, what day, what's going on, that determines my fate, it determines my personality, it determines the outcomes of my life. No, it doesn't do any of those things. A Jew would say that's heresy. Only God is sovereign. What you can tell, though, is that God is working a plan, because God's plans are linked to time. So we need to be paying attention to what the skies are doing, because they might tell us something about what God is about to do. Now, the people who are really into this would be the people at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They have a number of astronomical texts there. They track this like, let's put it this way. They separated from the Pharisees. They thought the Pharisees were liberals because the Pharisees used a calendar they didn't like. It's what, you know, we hear that and we think it's crazy, but they were that serious about it. But I want to move from this idea that there was a Jewish conception of the skies were important, what's going on here, because they telegraph certain things, to Revelation 12. Now, I can't prove this, but I suspect that what Paul was thinking, we actually have recorded in Revelation 12. But John, in Revelation, says this. You know, several times he says, I looked up in the sky and saw. What if John actually meant what he said? What if he's keying parts of Revelation to astronomical signage? What if he's doing that? A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Okay, verse 5 is crystal clear. It's quoting a messianic psalm. Okay, it's quoted elsewhere about Jesus. This is a reference to the birth of the Messiah. The notion of being caught up to God and his throne is a notion of the resurrection and ascension. But before that, you get all this astronomical imagery. Now, I'm not the first one to suggest this, but I suspect very strongly that this is what Paul was thinking about when he said, you know, hey, you know, have people heard about, you know, the Savior? You know, heard, you know, what's going on here? And, you know, again, you expect him to say no. And he says, well, yeah, they actually have. And then he quotes Psalm 19. See, Revelation 12 doesn't exist yet. Okay, Revelation is the last book of the New Testament, but he quotes Psalm 19. It says, yeah, they've heard. The heavens declare the glory of God, so on and so forth. All these verbs of communication. Paul is associating the knowledge of the Messiah King, his arrival, with something going on in the skies. That much we can say. And Revelation 12 gives us a pretty easy thing to track in an astronomy program. Now, I'm going to go through some of this. But before I do it, let me say what I'm not saying. There are those in evangelical circles, their belief was that you could look at the constellations of the skies and they told you the entire plan of salvation. Like they went through the Romans road, the heavens. I don't believe that. Okay, that overclaims the data. What I do believe is that, like the Magi, there's something going on at a certain time in history that told them there's going to be a divine king born in Bethlehem. Saddle up the camels. We have to go see. The Jews would have noticed it. Gentiles, like the Magi, would have noticed it because they were watching. And they believed that the Creator God, the God of Israel, was capable of telegraphing stuff like this. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar that the Qumran people used is the only calendar in the ancient world that creates a time window for the Messiah's arrival that matches Jesus. Okay, I don't think that's a coincidence. So having said that, let's get into what I think we can claim. On your screen, you see a few things. There's the sun and the moon, and then there's a line. The line is called the ecliptic. This is a line that astronomers will draw to track the movement of the constellations. You notice the sun and the moon there. The sun is in the midst of the woman, the virgin, Virgo. Okay, and Virgo, again, there's different ways to understand the 12 stars around her head, depending on which astronomer, you would read that you can get 12 stars in this or that method. But again, she's the woman with the 12 stars, the virgin who is about to give birth. The sun is in her midst. It's Revelation 12. And the moon is at her feet. You'll notice above her head, I've let my astronomy program show Regulus and Jupiter. Now, they are not mentioned in Revelation 12, but if you put the information in Revelation 12 into an astronomy program, this is produced. What's the big deal about Regulus and Jupiter? Jupiter was the king planet because it's the biggest one. Regulus was viewed as the king star because of its brightness. Okay, here they are overlapped. They are superimposed on each other. If you are one of these old ancient astronomy guys, that's going to draw your attention because both are associated with kingship. Constellation Virgo is the only constellation that represents a woman. For 20 days, Virgo was clothed with the sun, but the exact day when the moon was under her feet at the same time, and by the way, when Regulus and Jupiter intersect, and this is the view over Jerusalem, by the way, that could only occur during an 80-minute period within those 20 days. Okay, astronomy is linked to time, so we can calculate. You'll notice I've put the stick figures in now for the constellation so you can see this a little better. We've got in the center there, that's Virgo. She doesn't look as attractive as a stick figure. Sun, moon at her feet. Jupiter and Regulus co-joined. And what is the constellation above Virgo? It's the lion. It's Leo. What does that mean to a Jew? The lion is the sign of what? The tribe of Judah. Okay? Judah, Regulus and Jupiter are intersecting in Leo. What was that king, what tribe was he supposed to be from? Oh yeah, Judah. And you notice below her feet, in modern astronomy programs, we have two constellations. One is Libra, the other is Scorpio. In the ancient world, they were one constellation, and it was like a scorpion with pincers. And scorpions were at times referred to as a dragon, but you have another option for the dragon. That is Hydra, also located below Virgo, but off the ecliptic. Doesn't really matter, you got two choices. Okay, he's ready to devour the child when the child is born. There's a small window of time when all of these things are present. September 11, 3 BC date also corresponded, what a coincidence, to Rosh Hashanah, Tishri 1, New Year's Day for Jews, and the Day of Trumpets. Tishri 1 was also the New Year's Day of the civil calendar, according to the calendar accepted in Judah during the divided monarchy. In other words, it marked the first day of the reign of every new Davidic king. What a coincidence. So this collection in Revelation 12 isn't rare, although, to be fair, there's only a handful of dates in real time that could accommodate them in the context of New Testament chronology for the birth of Jesus. But those dates narrow to one date. Once other astronomical events that occurred at the same time, which are not noted in Revelation 12, are added to the celestial profile. One of these extra events is, in fact, the leading candidate for explaining the star seen by the Magi in Matthew 2. Now, what I'm going to cover here is just the basics. Martin, in his book, actually has a bunch of other things going on in the sky that, again, sort of solidify the really one best date for the birth of the Messiah. But I'm just going to hit, again, some of the main points here. The constellation directly above the head of Virgo. Again, this is stuff not mentioned in Revelation 12, but if we're looking at the sky like the Magi did, that constellation above the head of Virgo, the very next one in the zodiac, is Leo, the lion. Now, the lion was the symbol associated with the tribe of Judah, from which the Messiah would come. The association arose from Genesis 49, 9 and 10, where Jacob blessed Judah, referring to him in leonine terms, while prophesying that a ruler would come from his lineage. Now here's Genesis 49, I'll just read it. Verses 9 and 10. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, in other words, the nations. Okay? So this is where the Lion of Judah imagery comes from. It's part of the Torah. The lion-king association is confirmed in Revelation 5, verse 5. Quote, one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered. Now, the constellation Leo then was associated by Jews, Jewish astro-theologians, if you want to call them that, with royalty. The constellation of Leo is also important to Gentiles. It was the chief or head sign of the zodiac and had special importance in astrological circles. Now, that is a quote taken from Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. If you read through their Sun, Moon, and Stars article, you're going to find that. Leo was considered a royal constellation since it was dominated by the star Regulus. Regulus would have also been in the picture, again, the recreation of the circumstances of Revelation 12. So the star Regulus was known by astrologers as the king star. It was big and bright. Okay, so we have the king constellation. All right, the king constellation, Leo, Lion of Judah, and the star Regulus in that constellation in Leo. The status of Regulus in Leo is important because on one of the possible dates for the messianic birth, it came into conjunction with Jupiter. As the largest planet, Jupiter was considered the king planet in astro-theological thinking of the first century. As a result, the constellation Leo, the messianic sign of the Lion of Judah, to Jews who read the heavens, literally here, had two conjoined signs of a royal birth within it. So in other words, if you're the Magi, and again, you're familiar, but obviously with Gentile religious astronomical thinking, and you're familiar with the Hebrew scriptures because hey, you go to Bethlehem. If you're looking at this sign, you've got a virgin with 12 stars, the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet, the dragon. Okay, then above that you've got Leo, the lion. It's the symbol of the tribe of Judah, and within that constellation you have Jupiter, the king planet, and Regulus, the king star, overlapping. They're conjoined at this moment. Remember, we're talking about a 90-minute window where all these things are there. So the combination of astronomical signs produces a unique set of circumstances which can only be accounted for by one date that matters in the sweep of New Testament chronology. And this date, as we will see, again, I'm just going to say it here, but we'll talk more about it. This date has dramatic significance in the Jewish calendar. According to all of these signs taken together, and Martin, again, in chapter 5, has even more. According to all these signs in the heavens, the date of Jesus' birth, the birth of the Messiah, was September 11th, 3 BC. Now, when we hear September 11th, that just creeps us out, because of the context of that date in our own time. Now, there would be a whole separate show to talk about was September 11th, 2001 sort of a shot across the bow in terms of cosmic evil, for the fate of the earth and humanity and all that stuff? I think there's something to that because, again, I'm a supernaturalist. But I'm not going to go there in this episode. For this episode, we want to talk about the original September 11th date. Again, the birth of this Messiah child in Revelation 12. If we take the chapter for exactly what John says, I looked up at the heavens and saw. Okay, an example of astronomical prophecy, astro-theology, astral prophecy, whatever label you want to give it. Now, Martin, again, back to Martin, his book, I'll just read you one footnote because, again, he has a lot of other information there that can be borne out by an astronomy program. As Martin details in chapter 5 of his book, reading Revelation 12 this way correlates precisely with the chronological testimony of Luke concerning the timing of the birth of John the Baptist and his father's, that is Zechariah's, priestly duties at the temple, where the angel met him to announce John's birth. The primary objection to this date, to the September 11th, 3 BC date, is that it violates the accepted date for Herod's death, which most scholars put in 4 BC. You have to have Herod dying after the birth, because remember, the Magi come, it's at 1 or 2 years later, depending on how old you think Jesus is, at the time of the birth. They don't come, we have the 3 Magi, visiting, the manger. Okay, that is not what the scripture says. They come later. When the terminology for the child changes in the narrative. And again, this is very well known, and you could find this almost anywhere online or in most books that discuss what we're talking about today. The 3, we don't even know there were 3. We just infer that there were 3 because of the gifts. But the Magi come later than the actual birth event. Okay, and after that is when Herod dies. So there's basically 2 years. 2 years later, Herod dies. So he can't be dying in 4 BC if Jesus is born in 3 BC. It has to be Herod dying in 1 BC. So that requires that Herod die in 1 BC. Now, elsewhere in my footnote, I say, despite the objections of many to the September 11, 3 BC date on these grounds, a 1 BC date for Herod's death is indeed possible, and it's actually quite plausible. For recent research into how a 1 BC date for the death of Herod is historically coherent, I'm going to give you 2 sources. Now, I've mentioned these on my blog. If these are not publicly available, and frankly, one of them is really hard to find, but if you subscribe to the newsletter, you will have access by virtue of a link to a password protected, or not a password, protected folder, and you can read them yourself. There are 2 fundamental articles here. One is by Ormond Edwards. It's called Herodian Chronology. It's from the Palestine Exploration Quarterly, Volume 114, Issue 1, 1982. And the second one is by Andrew Steinman, much more recent. When Did Herod the Great Reign? It's in the scholarly journal Novum Testamentum, Volume 51, which is 2009. Now, the former article, Edwards, focuses on numismatics, that is, coins, Herodian coins, as evidence for reconsidering how Herod's dates are calculated and understood in terms of various calendars. And he comes out, he even has his several charts in the article, but he shows, hey, you're using Herodian coins, 1 BC, we'll tell you what calendar you're using and all that kind of stuff. It works. The latter article by Steinman casts a much wider net than Herodian coins. So he has a lot more data leading to a 1 BC death for Herod, while also chronicling the problems with the 4 BC consensus. So that the standard accepted date for Herod's death actually has its own problems, but you typically don't hear that because everybody sort of just accepts it. So I would recommend both of those articles, and a 1 BC Herod death date is not an insurmountable problem by any stretch for the view that I'm articulating here. So back again to the subject matter. Let's talk about Jupiter. Again, we have Jupiter Regulus conjunction in Leo. Jupiter is important because it is, you can read a lot of astronomers here, the best explanation for the quote-unquote star of Matthew 2, whose movement or perceived movement was tracked by the Magi. Jupiter is well known for what astronomers call retrograde motion, the appearance of movement back and forth in the night sky. Jupiter's first conjunction with Regulus began on September 14th, 3 BC, in the year that we're talking about here, 3 BC, and it continued through September 11th, 3 BC, and then on December 1st, 3 BC, Jupiter stopped its normal course through the fixed stars and began its annual retrogression or backward motion. In doing so, it once again headed toward the star Regulus. Then on February 17th, 2 BC, the two were reunited. So it's moving around a lot between 3 BC and 2 BC. So again, astronomers have known this for a long time. The, again, perception of Jupiter's movement for just about everybody who kind of tracks on this thing is the best explanation for the star and Magi too. So you have, again, all this going on between, just before the Messiah is actually born, and then during the, on into the time when the Magi are going to start their journey, and it takes, quite a while, to get to Bethlehem. So during that whole interval of time, Jupiter's doing stuff. And so this just becomes the best candidate for what the Magi saw in reference to Matthew 2. The timing is right. the Magi embark on their journey a year or so after Jesus was actually born, and this is what they're looking at. Now, I have another footnote here about the terminology in Matthew 2:11. So in Matthew 2:11, the child Jesus is referred to with the Greek term paidion, as opposed to brephos in Luke 1:41. While the former can be used of an infant or toddler, the latter is only used of newborn infants or children in utero. So either one of those. And that comes from the entry in the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. Now, Martin points out that the account in the New Testament said the Magi saw the star rising, above the eastern horizon, because they're at a location east of Jerusalem. And in August 12, 3 BC, Jupiter rose as a morning star, which soon came into conjunction with Venus. If the Magi began their own journey toward Jerusalem near this time, this apparent westward motion of Jupiter each day would have indicated to the Magi to proceed in the same westward direction toward Jerusalem. Martin follows this by noting that the Magi could have been, quote unquote, following Jupiter in the example as it was setting. The Bible says the star, quote, went ahead of them, unquote. Upon reaching Jerusalem, the Magi were told to look toward Bethlehem for the newborn king, or they could have known, Micah 5:2. Again, they probably don't know that because of what they ask, Herod, hey, where's the king of the Jews? And, it just depends how you take the conversation, what you think they knew or didn't know, or are they being cryptic? Are they, poking for information? What's going on? So you can read it different ways. But anyway, all of this occurred when the New Testament says the star, quote unquote, came to a halt in the heavens. That's Matthew 2:9. Jupiter stopped its motion and stood over where the young child was. In a word, the celestial body became stationary. Martin references Kittle's Theological Dictionary for this point in commenting on the passive form of the Greek word for the star's behavior. The Greek there is estathe. Kittle quotes from Schlater's commentary, which is in German. In translation, it says, in distinction from estathe implies that the star halted. Unquote. Again, you can look at that if you have Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, you can look it up. So, Martin, has done some homework here. He's not just making it up, but he's aligning the language quite coherently with the behavior of Jupiter. Now, so that brings us to the point where we've talked about the sign of Revelation 12, the signs that John gives us. If you're looking at the sky, then you have these other things going on, and I've narrowed our discussion to the Jupiter Regulus conjunction in Leo. Again, Martin has more if you want it. That gives us a birth of Jesus on September 11th, 3 BC. However, that date is also the Day of Trumpets, or was also the Day of Trumpets, and it has a connection to Noah's flood. And so here we're going to drift into the reversing Hermann sort of stuff. The astronomical context of John's description of what he saw in the heavens in Revelation 12 puts the birth of Jesus on September 11th, 3 BC. Again, that part, we know, we can see that. Again, just put it in an astronomy program, you're going to get that. The literary context of Revelation 12 is of relevance here. Immediately preceding Revelation 12, John described the heavenly appearance of the temple and the Ark of the Covenant, Revelation 11:19. The ark was the central symbol of God's presence with Israel. The birth of the child in Revelation 12 was John's way of saying that the presence of God had indeed returned to the earth in the form of this child, the Messiah. New Testament scholar Greg Beale notes the significance of this juxtaposition, the Genesis 11 and the Genesis 12. The reference to the ark and the temple, and the reference is given to in Revelation 12, verse 7. These signs. Beale writes this: a trumpet was to be blown on Tishri 1, which in the rabbinic period came to be viewed as the beginning of the new year. God's eschatological judgment of all people was expected to fall on this day. The New Year trumpet also proclaimed hope in the ongoing and ultimate kingship of God, in God's judgment and reward according to people's deeds, and in Israel's final restoration. That's Beale, page 620, and he actually alludes to the Babylonian Talmud, Rosh Hashanah 16, for that information. Now, incredibly, again, we've left Beale now, this is me. Incredibly, the astronomical reconstruction of the circumstances of Revelation 12, 1-7 that produces a September 11th, 3 BC date for the birth of the Messiah was also the beginning of the Jewish New Year in 3 BC, Rosh Hashanah, Tishri 1, the Day of the Trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets. And Tishri 1 was also the day that many of the ancient kings and rulers of Judah reckoned as their inauguration day. This procedure was followed consistently in the time of Solomon, Jeremiah, and Ezra. And if you want proof of that, you can look at Edwin Thiel, Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, page 28, 31, 161, 163. I would say this is a powerful piece of evidence for the astronomical reading of Revelation 12, 1 through 7 as celestial signs of the birth of the Messianic King. Again, there are just too many coincidences here. There's too many things that are coinciding and aligning neatly. Jewish tradition also held that the Day of Trumpets was the day that commemorated the beginning of the world. Again, this was Jewish tradition, in other words, the very first day of the human calendar. As Jewish historian Theodore Gaster writes, quote, Judaism regards New Year's Day not merely as an anniversary of creation, but more importantly as a renewal of it. This is when the world is reborn, unquote. That's from Gaster's Festivals of the Jewish New Year. Although it might sound odd, this tradition is part of a matrix of ideas that link Tishri 1, which of course is September 11, 3 BC, the birth of the Messiah in that year. It links Tishri 1 to the sin of the watchers, the flood of Noah, and the Nephilim. You say, how in the world? Well, let's examine that for a few minutes. The first step toward discerning these connections is to understand the Jewish calendar, at least insofar as it relates to our topic. The ancient Israelite, biblical, and Jewish calendrical circumstances are like our own in that multiple calendars are in play. I mean, we use more than one calendar. In modern Western civilization, it's common to have a calendar that maps the seasons, one that maps the school year, one that maps the fiscal year. Again, all three calendars would cover 12 months, but their beginning points would differ. And we get that. Today, the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, occurs on the first and second days of Tishri. Anyone who's Jewish or who has Jewish friends knows, however, that this New Year's Day and the New Year's Day we celebrate according to the modern Gregorian calendar are, of course, not the same. Jewish Rosh Hashanah occurs in the fall season, somewhere in September and October. The first month of the year is Tishri, and that occurs in the fall. Fall was, of course, the season of the harvest, an important idea to which we will return in a moment. Exodus 12, 1 and 2, though, suggest that the first month of the Israelite calendar, in more ancient times, was not Tishri. After the Israelites escaped Egypt, the first month was aligned with the Passover. That's Exodus 12:3, in order to commemorate the new beginning of the Israelite nation after the Exodus from Egypt. The calendar of Exodus 12 detached the first season of the calendar from the agricultural harvest. Remember that the new year began in the fall. In the quote-unquote original calendar, in Exodus 12, it gets changed so that the new year aligns with the Passover. So the first month of the new calendar, the one that starts in Exodus 12, is Nisan, and you have a reference to that in Esther 3:7. Now, of these two calendars, the agricultural calendar that had Tishri as the first month is the oldest in Israelite history, predating the Exodus. The biblical text contains hints of this older calendar in certain passages that describe the ending of the year. Exodus 23:16, Exodus 34:22. Whereas Tishri marked the fall season, the end of the year was marked by the Feast of Ingathering. Fall harvest, ingathering, they're different things here. The important point for our purposes is that the most ancient Israelite calendar began with Tishri, which fell in the fall season with a harvest after the rains had produced the fall crop. As Gaster noted, this month was considered a memorial of creation. Why? Well, the answer is simple. Genesis has Adam and Eve placed in a lush garden, Eden. Because of the availability of food for Adam and Eve, the creation must have begun in the harvest season. This is how the Jews reasoned this tradition. And so the earliest Hebrew calendar began the year in the harvest season. Hence, the first month, Tishri, fell in the fall harvest. This logic produces the idea that the Israelite New Year signaled a renewal of creation. Now, again, if this is in your head, and you're thinking Tishri 1, if you go back to the September 11, 3 BC, not only do you have the birth of the Messiah, Tishri 1, which is the inauguration day of kings, but that day also meant a renewal of creation. Again, it was new life, right? In simplest terms, but it's more than that even. In her fascinating scholarly essay, and I'm also going to put this in the folder. So if you subscribe to the newsletter, you're going to get this article too. Dr. Ellen Robbins wrote an essay called "The Pleiades, the Flood, and the Jewish New Year." Robbins is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. She is not a hack. She's not Billy Bob on the internet, okay? This is not Christian Middle Earth stuff. This is Johns Hopkins University, and she's going to map this whole thing out in Jewish tradition. Again, what we do here in the Naked Bible podcast is we don't speculate and call it teaching. Okay, I take you to actual academic sources. So here we go. Now, Robbins details how this ancient calendrical thinking factored into the interpretation of the flood story, including its preamble about the sons of God and the Nephilim. Let's start at Genesis 7. Okay, so we're working to how September 11th and Tishri 1 and the signs in the sky and the inauguration of the king and the renewal of creation, how all of that also maps over to the Jewish interpretation of the flood, including the sons of God and the Nephilim. That's where we're going here, because when we understand that, we're going to see how in the Jewish mind, this date, this event on this date, which can be mapped astronomically with precision, and it works all the way through, okay? We're going to see how a Jew who understood these things would have looked at their Messiah as the one who would reverse the impact and the terrible effects, not just of Genesis 3, not just the fall, but of what happened before the flood, and that was part of bringing on the flood, this disaster. Okay, the Sons of God event of Genesis 6 and the Nephilim. It was all one content matrix for them. And again, we are so ignorant of this kind of stuff that we just miss so much material, so much theology that's lurking in the biblical text. That it's just a crying shame. Again, this is why Naked Bible Podcast exists. This is why we write what we write. This is the goal, to try to help you think about your Bible the way the ancient people thought about it, so that when they wrote, the original writers wrote, you can read it to understand what they wanted you to understand. Okay, so you can think their thoughts after them and not somebody else's thoughts. Not a reformer, not the Catholic Church. Okay, fill in the blank. Okay, we're concerned about what the writer wrote and what he intended you to know and to think. That's what we're doing here. So let's go back to Genesis 7, Robbins' article, again, linking this to the tradition and how the Jews understood the flood. In Genesis 7, we read this. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went with him into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps in the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were open. That's Genesis 7 portion there. Let me give you the exact verse references here. It's Genesis 7, verses 6 through 11. Now, according to this passage, Noah had already turned 600. Catch the wording there. Noah had already turned 600 when the flood began. And it began in the 600th year of Noah's life in the second month. Okay? Noah had already turned 600 by the time of the second month. Just keep that in your head. As the flood waters were subsiding just after the dove was released from the ark for the last time, Genesis 8 provides this chronological note. This is Genesis 8, 13 through 16. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. End of quote. Now the math here is pretty transparent. Barely over a year after the flood began, Noah and his family left the ark in the second month of the year. Noah had turned 601 by the time he had left the ark. Why is this noteworthy? Well, because Jewish tradition took this chronology to mean that Noah's birthday was Tishri 1, first month. This is the same day. Again, if you have been taught this as a Jew, and you're tracking with all the rest of the stuff that we've talked about in this episode, This would be the same day as the birth of the Messiah, Jesus. So to many Jews, they would have believed that the Messiah, Jesus, and Noah shared a birthday. So when was the Messiah actually born? Again, I think we're told that. I think we're told that in Revelation 12. I think that Paul knew this and understood it. And when he says in Romans 10:18, look, yeah, we still need to go preach. I'm the apostle of the Gentiles. We got to tell people what happened at the cross. But people should at least have known. Everyone should know. They could have known, they should have known that the Messiah had come. The divine royal deliverer had come. You say, how in the world, Paul? Are you an acid or something? Where are you getting that? I'll tell you where I'm getting it from Psalm 19. Okay, their voice has gone out through all the earth. Whose voice? Read Psalm 19. Again, it's the message of the stars. So it's actually a coherent set of ideas that goes into this talk about Jesus' birth. And again, I don't really, if you do any reading, you're going to find out, well, why was it aligned to December 25th? And why did the church do this, to that, the other thing? Hey, go read that. Okay, they had their reasons for doing that, pragmatic as they were. But if you really want to know, and you really want to know how it fits and what it meant and the picture that it gives you, this is what you should be tracking on. Now, before we wrap up, I want to say two other things, two final thoughts, just again for the sake of having them on record. Again, critics of the September 11/3 BC date focus only on the Herod problem, which has been resolved. Go get the sources and read them. A 1 BC date is entirely workable. The critics don't consider all this other stuff. I mean, there's just a truckload of it. All this other information that dovetails with Revelation 12 and the date it produces, it's coherent and meaningful to both a Jewish and a Gentile audience. The critics don't think about that stuff. They either avoid it or they're ignorant of it. No other date produced textually, traditionally, astronomically accounts for all of the data. Therefore, no other date can account for the imagery and the symbolism and the theology. If you want to attack the September 11/3 BC date, then show me another date that accounts for all of it. That's your challenge.